Welcome, Peter Tyra, the author of Polax. This is another edition of Channel A Media. Now, we're talking to you, but hang on. Before I do that, Peter, I need to read this, right? It's off the back of the book, yeah, Polax. It says, it is 1967. A mysterious disease appears in an English town. People fall down suddenly, polaxed, and many die. It is caused by a bacterium, a virus, a poison. Nobody knows, and top doctors squabble over its cause. But then two junior doctors and a young anthropology student who has recovered from the disease join together. Now that sounds awfully similar to what we're going through. When did you come up with this?
Well, I started writing this in 2018 on a Faber writing course, and so it was completely coincidental. At that time, we didn't know anything about COVID, and by the time I finished it in October 2019, and that was before anyone had mentioned COVID, and the outbreak had started in Wuhan in China. I know the natural question is, why did you write it? And
well, yeah, we'd have got to that one. Yeah, why did you write it? Yeah.
Well, it was, first of all, I wanted to point out that things were very different in 1967 than they are now. At that time, there was a complete separation almost of mental and physical disease, and you didn't combine them together. Now everyone realizes that most diseases have a mental component. Usually it follows the physical disease. But this one was slightly different in Polax, because rather than saying that some people have underlying conditions and therefore might get the disease or get it seriously, instead of saying that they've got underlying physical conditions, I was postulating, saying, well, what happened if this virus actually only affected people with underlying mental conditions? In this case, some people who are highly anxious and not other people. And I think in 1967, they would have been very perplexed by that. They wouldn't have picked it up. And that's why it's these three juniors, as it were, including a patient, who actually pick up the idea, because the profession at that time wasn't very good at taking into account mental pathology.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because you know, when you read through the book, you've got this pompous, almost seems like outdated industry. You know, you've got the mental health side of things, but because it's not scientific in its outlook, it's a bit poo-pooed.
Well, yes, it's important to realize that people didn't go into general hospitals if they were psychiatrists. Psychiatrists belonged in the asylums, as they were called in the past, and then they became mental hospitals later on. And you only went to a general hospital usually to see someone who'd taken an overdose or something like that, and then you made an assessment and then left. So there was very little discussion about mental health in people with physical disease, and that's what I really wanted to get over. And it's been accentuated by the fact that I've been particularly interested in that in the last 20 years because of people who worry about their health. Is that most people who worry about their health go along to doctors and just get reassured. People don't recognize that worry about your health is actually a mental health disease. It's a condition that needs attention. And this is the same thing in Polax. In Polax, people just think, oh, well, these people have collapsed. This isn't a disease like COVID, because it's a disease that affects the muscles like polio. And that's why they get Polax. They just get instantly to fall to the ground because their muscles stop working. But when in fact they get more anxious, the disease comes back again when they appear to be getting better. Now, the average doctor at that time would not consider that it could be anything to do with your mental health that you suddenly got your disease again. They'd be measuring all the things wrong with your muscles and saying, oh, well, that's what's wrong with your condition. You've got this muscle paralysis, and this is due to this nerve problem. They wouldn't think of the mental health component. And that's why I say in the book, the patient, who is a key part of the book, because she's been through it and she recognizes it, and two junior doctors pick this up. And of course, because they pick it up and the big noises don't, they get ostracized and criticized and generally not accepted for their views until, of course, it all comes out later on.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I mean, I've got to be honest with you, I couldn't put the book down because once I got on into it and you're working your way through the chapters, you've got a very natural way. I'm gonna liken you to J.K. Rowling. Now, there's something to be said. And the only reason why I say that is because with the Potter books, that was the same, the flow. The narrative just went from one to another and you were gripped by the end of each chapter. Well, what's going to happen now? You know, this young girl that's actually debilitated by this, how is she going to manage? You know, she's in with the old age pensioners or older personnel, but she actually plays quite a big part in it, doesn't she?
Well,
Barbara,
well, she's the key part of it. And it's interesting because some of the reviewers have said, oh, this is very fanciful. The idea that a young girl who doesn't never had any medical training can suddenly pick up this, and these junior doctors have only just started their careers. How could they pick this up? The fact is, when you think outside the box much more when you're younger, and this is right. What comes out here is that these three people, and particularly, of course, the fact that it's sometimes difficult to follow, and it's fair to say that many of the readers, particularly if they come from a sort of literary background, might not be able to follow the plot. But when in fact Barbara realizes that when she gets very anxious, she gets paralyzed again. She's the person who realizes that. Nobody else does.
Right.
So she knows it happened to her. And then when in fact the anxiety goes away, she recovers her movements again. So it's right. You don't have to be particularly really clever to pick that up and to make note of it. And the interesting thing is, of course, she passes this on and the other people don't pick it up. The other thing which is perhaps worth mentioning is that the very pompous public health figure who gets very angry about the idea that this could be mental health, of course, as a lot of people who have had mental health problems, and it comes through later in the book, he had it later on. He described a problem when he was a schoolboy, when he was treated very badly at a combined cadet force camp. And incidentally, unfortunately, that was an episode I knew all about because I was there at the time. That they suppress the idea that they've had a mental problem, and then get even angrier about the idea that mental health might be an issue in a physical case, because they almost want to drive that message, drive that memory out of their mind. And that's really what's happened to him in that book. And that's why he gets so annoyed, and that's why he gets dissected by David Frost very clinically in the interview later on television. And incidentally, I was at university with David Frost, and he did that absolutely perfectly. He was a brilliant interviewer. As soon as he found a crack in someone's thinking, he opened it up, and it was. He opened it up.
Yeah. I mean, with regards to the two professions, because you've got like your scientific-based doctors and everything else, and then you've got your psychologists and everything. Why is there such a divide in the faction?
Well, the real divide is, unfortunately, because in medicine now, didn't apply 200 years ago, in medicine you can turn to a test. If you say, oh, I think this person has got XY disease, you could do a blood test or an X-ray or a scan which confirms that disease. In psychiatry, you can't do that. You haven't got an independent test to show someone's got a disease. And so you have to rely on the clinical skills of the person who's making the assessment. And if you think psychiatrists are very dim people who can't do anything properly, and they come to a conclusion, and there isn't a test there to confirm it. Oh well, of course it's all inside their head. It doesn't really exist, and that's the problem which comes over, and it's repeatedly shown in the book, but it's still shown now. Although it is fair to say that what is called mental health literacy, understanding about mental health, is much better now than it was in 1967.
When I was reading through Poleaxed, I started to realise that there were street names that represented Newark, and then it suddenly hit me. Hang on a minute, this must be. He's set this in Newark. He's got to have done. Why did you set it in Newark?
Well, I thought Newark was an ideal place. If you wanted to sort of think of an equivalent to the Great Plague in 1666, the famous place in 1666 in the plague years was the village of Eam in Derbyshire, where the vicar there cut off the whole of the village from the rest of the county of Yorkshire, because he realised the plague was going to go to other parts of the county if in fact people were allowed out of the village. And so he sealed the whole village off, and of course this was perfect public health. It was locked down, and so in many ways Newark, which is a slightly bigger place than Eam, although some of my reviewers seem to think it is a village in the book when they comment on the book, Newark in some ways is an ideal place to lock down, as it were, to quarantine. That's why all parts of the town were blocked off, apart from 4 entrances that no doubt you picked up, A, B, C and D, were for the main roads going into Newark. And so that I think was a very good analogy for a disease which is not as important to realise, and many of my readers still think it's like COVID. This is not a highly transmissible disease. It's only affect people who are very anxious, and therefore it's not as though it's going to spread like wildfire. But when you've got a condition like that, it's a good idea to quarantine a town, and that's what happens in the book, with the agreement of the medical officer of health, who is actually modelled on the existing medical officer of health at that time, who happens to be the father of a friend of mine. So, in fact, that would be entirely consistent. And in some ways, there was a similar epidemic of typhoid 3 years earlier in 1964 in Aberdeen. And exactly the same thing happened in Aberdeen. They wanted to identify every case of typhoid and cut the town off so that people couldn't transmit typhoid elsewhere, and that was remarkably effective. So we have a model of a different type of epidemic, not like COVID, which is so much more infectious, where in fact if you actually seal off a town, you do a very good service to public health, because you prevent it being spread elsewhere.
The thing with this is, because this is so real in our minds at the moment, you know, with the pandemic and almost like germ warfare, I call it. I'm being ex-service, and that's how I actually look at it. You know, we can't see it, we can't touch it, but by heavens, it's there. It's about, where did you come up with the idea for you know your actual little anxiety issue?
Well, it's difficult to know really, because it wasn't. It was just that I thought the key thing was, what would it be like to have a disease which only affected people with certain mental conditions? And at the moment, we don't know of any disease that does that in a sort of specific sense. I mean, for example, we know that people with intellectual disability, people with limited intelligence, they're much more likely to get certain illnesses than others, like diabetes and so on. But we don't know of any disease, an infectious disease, which only affects people with certain mental health vulnerability.
Yeah.
but it's quite possible, and it will happen in time. So I thought, well, let's write a book about the first example of this, and that's really that's really started the whole thing off. And after that, it just ran away.
Yeah, because I mean, you make the reference in the book that was from Malaysia. Is that right?
Well, yes. Oddly enough, I suggested the disease originated in Malaysia, and of course the COVID originated in China. But the that again was just entirely in my head. I mean, there was no particular reason why it should have originated in Asia. But the other interesting aspect of it was that if you are highly anxious, then you get the disease. If you're not anxious at all, you never get the disease. And in the story, and I did the research on this, and it was confirmed by a psychiatric colleague who lives in Malaysia. The tribe in the Cameron Highlands of Malaysia, which is the original source of this disease, which is spread by a tick in the first instance and then transmitted from human to human. But the tribe that lives in those highlands actually are non-anxious. The reason they're non-anxious is that they share all their dreams, and their dreams determine what happens for their next day. So in the morning, they discuss their dreams. Well, this was it. Whether they still do it's another matter, but certainly it was true in the past, that they share their dreams, and because they know exactly what's going to happen to them, they're not anxious. So if they get bitten by this tick and get the disease, they don't get the disease because they're non-anxious people. So this could explain why it apparently comes out of nowhere. It's there, but only the people who get anxious have it. And because the people who live in the highlands concerned don't have anxiety, they don't get the disease. So it all makes sense.
Of course, yeah, of course it does. You're thinking outside the box, and why not? I've got to say, I mean, some of your characters that you've developed within that book, were they actually based on anybody from the past, or was it just your imagination, you know, just being let loose? Because they seem very well rounded.
Well, virtually everything is based to some extent on characters from the past, and the very smooth William Fothergill, who is the head of the hospital, who wants to take all the credit, even though he doesn't deserve any of it, for the discovery. He's very like a teacher I had at St. Thomas's Hospital, who was very smooth and very effective. He eventually became a knight and was actually became a senior member of the royal household, but he did it by his maneuvering, not by his particular abilities. And of course, the medical profession is full of people who advance through politics, not through tremendous merit. So he was a very good example of that. The bad-tempered bacteriologist, who was always a Scottish chap who was always criticising everybody. An awful lot of people in the background of medicine, very important people, often very bad-tempered and grumpy people, partly because they don't get recognised enough.
Right.
And the matron in the story is a perfect example of the matron at St. Thomas's Hospital, which St. Thomas's Hospital had the best nursing school in the country, where I went to as a student, because it was the Florence Nightingale School of Nursing, set up by Florence Nightingale in the 19th century, and only the best of students went there. In fact, one of the embarrassing things that was found when students did go there, that they did a test one year of an IQ test of the nurses and of the medical students, and the nurses came out brighter than the medical students, so they never published it.
Yeah, I love it.
So the matron there, they were very powerful figures in the old days, 967, that applied to them, and they were really the powerhouse. Their powerhouses, and particularly with something like an epidemic, they made absolutely certain that everything was done properly.
Yeah, because I mean that comes across in the book. I mean, especially with her level of discipline that she expects You know, you're there to do the job, you get on with it and you go. There's no dilly-dally or, fluffing about. That was all. But tell me about Barbara. Barbara intrigues me.
Well, some people have said in the reviews that Barbara is an unrealistic character because she behaves out of character once or twice in the book, especially over her sexual behavior. But she is modelled on someone I knew at university who was, again, in 1967, she was interested in anthropology. Anthropologists are obsessed by rites of passage and virginity being lost in special occasions. And she spent the first year at university working out how she was going to lose her virginity. Now, that wasn't particularly what Barbara was doing, but Barbara was also, she had this disease, it affects your nervous system. She might have been a little bit less inhibited than she would be normally, but she was escaping from this dominating mother and this Methodist household where everyone behaved absolutely properly and she was controlled by mother, and to be let off the reins, to realize she had a life to lead and she could become a person in her own right. That's really what comes through in the book, and you can see from what is a completely crippled, chronically anxious person at the beginning becomes a very well-adjusted, young and powerful woman at the end.
She does.
And
that's what's interesting.
Yeah.
It really is, because you actually see that change from meek and mild to very strong and dominant.
Yeah.
With the contrasts that go in there, which almost leads me to be honest, nidotherapy. Well, when you start looking at it, there seems to be links within that there.
Well, I don't want to sort of make too much of that specifically, but it is relevant. You see, what in nidotherapy was illustrating that the environment could do an awful lot, which is positive for your mental health.
Right.
Nidotherapy, it's someone else who helps you to do it. In this case, in Barbara's case, she does it, she works out on her own. But the fact is that all the environmental factors that come through in Polax are all positive as far as Barbara is concerned. And therefore, that's one of the reasons she changes. And this is what I find very important in mental health, because unfortunately, and it was certainly true in 1967, many people said, why are you going into psychiatry? People with mental health problems never get better. Once you've had the scar of mental health, you're going to go on having it the rest of your life. That's completely untrue. Even for lots of conditions which would appear to be chronic, if you get the right environment for people, where in fact they can flourish, then the mental health aspects disappear. And of course, that shows it perfectly in Polax, because by the end of the book, you find no mental health pathology at all.
No, right. So you've also got two other characters there. You've got Giles, haven't you? Who's on the wall.
Yeah, well, Giles is a very good example. Again, it's based on someone I know who comes from New Zealand, who just gets on with things. New Zealanders tend to get on with things without kicking up a fuss about it. And they're logical and they're sensible, and they listen to people. I usually find New Zealanders are the least pompous people you could meet, because they always are respectful, polite, and yet they say things like it is. They don't sort of fladdle around. They just speak as it is. And Giles is one of those characters in the book. He's given this job by Dr. Porton, the pompous public health man, and he gets on with it, and he looks at it like a detective story, and of course that's how it turns out to be.
Yeah.
So he comes out as he's the only one who's actually completely unflawed, in the sense that he doesn't do anything, he doesn't step out of line at all. He's solid all the way through. The other character, Stephen,
he was interesting. I found him interesting.
Yeah, well, he's interesting because he's an ambitious psychiatrist who wants to make his name in the subject, and he realizes it's not very easy doing that in a mental hospital in the back and beyond. And so that's why he's so excited by the prospect of treating Barbara and finding out with Barbara, because she helps him, to find out that anxiety is the underlying cause of this condition. And one thing which, again, perhaps the average reader may not pick up, but he writes this letter to the British Medical Journal, which is published, and writing a letter which is published in the British Medical Journal, it's a sort of real high spot for a young, ambitious doctor to get it published. And I think that's one of the reasons why he partly doesn't quite accede to Barbara's charms, because he feels, well, she's helped me to get this paper out. So I think I need to give her something back. And obviously that's not the right way of looking at it, but in fact, that's the sort of feeling at the time. And so he is, I think, again, a realistic character for the time. Not so much now. The other thing, which is perhaps fair to say, is that in the 1960s, these were the swinging 60s, there was a lot of things going on, hanky-panky going on between doctors and patients and doctors and nurses and everything else. It's everything, people pick this up now to a greater extent, but that was not out of keeping with what happened at the time. I'm not saying I support it or condemn it or in any way. I'm just reporting this is reflects what happened in 1967.
Right. The thing that was interesting with that character of Stephen was the fact, although he was married, he's a young man and everything else, he didn't succumb to the temptation 100%, did he?
No, he didn't, and he wouldn't have done. I mean, that was perhaps it wasn't explained fully, but he wouldn't have done, and nor would she, because in fact it was this was all the way in which Barbara was looking at it was an anthropological experiment.
Right. Yeah.
And the idea was that Stephen had done an experiment with her that showed that anxiety was the cause of prolapse. This was going to be a sort of payback, as it were. Again, it's a sort of nonsense thought, but that was the sort of thinking going on at the time. So, so although some people, one person who was reading the book on the Pigeonhole digital book club, when they got to that point, said, "I'm not going to read this book any further because these characters are behaving." These people are behaving completely out of character, and therefore I'm giving up on it. Well, of course, if he continued, he would have realised it wasn't quite as it seemed, and it was sort, and it's sort of balanced out later on. And I do find the other point, which I wanted to, it's surprising really, because many of the women reading this, well, not said, many of the people reading this book said, how could a young student find the cause of this disease on her own, more or less? It's ridiculous. Well, one of the things that was really true in 1950s and 1960s, that women never got credit for scientific discovery. I mean, there's a famous case of Rosalind Franklin, who was a key person to discover the structure of DNA, and she was completely written out of the articles and never got the Nobel Prize like the other three men did, and they all made fun of her. And there were an awful lot of women in science in the 1950s and 60s, now it'd be very different, who were more or less downplayed. Their contribution was regarded as unimportant. And this is a sort of attempt to compensate for that, to try and there's no doubt that male scientists in that era were very bad to their female equivalents, and this is compensating for that error.
Well, I think you've done well there to actually compensate them, because I mean, when I was reading it, and then for me, it's because she was in that environment, you know, with the other patients and everything else. She was acting like the observer, and she could actually see what was going on. So I was sitting there and I was thinking, well, no, if I was there and I was in her shoes, I would be 100% looking at them and seeing where the changes are, because she wasn't a stupid girl by any stretch of the imagination, was she?
No, and of course she was an anthropology student, and anthropologists
Right.
are good at observing, one of their skills, and so it was hardly difficult for her to find out that all these people, the famous five as they were called,
Yeah.
in the book, all had chronic anxiety problems.
Mm. Let me ask you: would you have written this differently? Yeah, if you'd have known about the coronavirus, do you think it'd have been a different subject matter or what?
I wouldn't have written it very differently. I think that what I would have done is emphasize that it wasn't like flu or COVID. It was a completely different disease, because of course, no, I don't mention that anywhere. I mentioned typhoid, but I don't mention anything like flu or any respiratory disease. And therefore, because of course these epidemics, I mean, it's important to realize that polio was as bad as COVID at one point, but of course, again, polio was never, this was a disease which was affected the muscles and the nerves. It never affected the breathing. But I would have obviously emphasized in writing it again that this was very different from COVID. And again, one of the problems that some of my readers had said they couldn't understand why people weren't obsessed with wearing masks all the way through the book, when in fact it wasn't being transmitted. In fact, it's not actually made clear how it's being transmitted. It's I've left that in the air, but it certainly wasn't. People were not getting ill if they didn't wear masks, so again, Matron Arbuthnot and her good nurses, they picked up what was sensible and what wasn't sensible, and they wouldn't say everyone's got to wear a mask. They can't allow anything. They just, once it was found out that there was nothing, it wasn't seriously infectious, then in fact relaxations were reduced. So again, these things I would have emphasised if I'd known about COVID, and obviously there's some other parallels there as well. But I don't think the fundamental premise of the story would have altered.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think they would have done back in '67, having this placed on their plate? Do you reckon they'd have managed?
Well, I think it would have been very difficult, because, of course, the big problem there is that they took a great deal longer to develop vaccines. Viruses were really very badly understood in 1960s, because all the magnification of the microscopes and everything else, and all they could be identified, but they certainly, all the changes and the variants that we've found now, that sort of thing was completely missing to them. So but they would have had to concentrate on public health measures. And it's interesting, of course, is that those measures hadn't changed. So they would have actually emphasized the question of social distancing and lockdown and everything else. And that would have been the main form of treatment. I think the nearest equivalent was Spanish flu, which happened in 1918, right at the end of the war. And Spanish flu was complicated, really, because it's not a straightforward virus. It was a virus that led to an infection by a bacterium, which blocked up your nasal passages, and you almost got choked to death by them. But the virus set it all off to begin with. But interesting enough, the same sort of policy and public health strategy was used for that. And it may not be fully known, but for example, in Australia, they said anyone who came back to Australia in 1918 from the war or any other place, they had to be quarantined for 2 weeks. They weren't allowed to get out. They came back to port,
right.
they were put in quarantine. And Australia had virtually no cases of Spanish flu, virtually no cases, because they managed to do what we should be doing with COVID,
Sure.
observing the quarantine and social distancing and stopping the infection from spreading.
Good heavens. It's interesting. Now, I need to ask you this question because I know, with your writing course that you've been on, your Faber and Faber, you've written a couple of other little books. What's next? What's in the pipeline? Do you think you found your niche with the medical side of things, or what?
Well, I've got 3 books, other books, and it's fair to say, I mean, I've come to this business rather late in the day, and I'm experimenting with the writing. But the book which is coming out next, and that is being published in October this year, is called Millie and Oscar Go Loco, and is entirely based on characters like my grandchildren, who are, like lots of grandchildren, inquisitive, curious, and bright, and think outside the box in many ways. But they, in fact, in this book, they befriend a person who's got significant mental illness. It's called hoarding. It's called a disorder now, hoarding disorder, where people can't stop accumulating rubbish everywhere in their houses. But this hoarder is also a very clever man, and he's an experimental physicist. And without going into too much detail, because I don't want to
No, don't spoil it.
the plot, give too many details of the plot, these people attempt to stop a metal asteroid which is on course to wipe out the Earth. They managed to prevent this asteroid from hitting the Earth with the help of this eccentric inventor. So it's a very powerful story for 8 to 10-year-olds, and it's got a lot of things about climate change and other things, and that's being published in October.
Oh, that's good. And where will people be able to get that from?
Well, that's being published by the same publisher, the Book Guild, and they
Would it be on Amazon or somewhere like that?
It'll be available on Amazon and all the other things. It's difficult to get a following for children's books unless you're well established. But I think the story will sell itself, really. It's a very good story, and it explains why. And the trouble is, with many stories about children, they go into fantasy. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with fantasy, like the Narnia stories and so on. Fantasy is marvelous. But in this story, again, it could all be feasible. And this story,
you see that but
it's all
that's
about,
the one thing.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, there's one thing that I admire about you, and it does come through with your with your books and everything else. Everything seems to be plausible.
Yes, I think,
you know what I mean.
Well, that's why I think it's plausible, and it hangs together. And of course, the interesting thing about plausible stories is that quite often they turn out to be correct. I mean, one of my favourite writers is John Wyndham. Of course, people don't know him much now because he wrote in the 20, 30 years ago. And there was a book he wrote about called Trouble with Lichen, and this was a substance extracted from a lichen which stops people from growing old.
Right.
And of course, it's very popular among young ladies who don't want to get lines on their faces, and all sorts of things go on in the book. But the interesting thing is, they have found a substance now which does that. It stops, which looks it retards aging, and that was found 20 years after John Wyndham wrote this book, Trouble with Lichen. So I think that when you have a story which is plausible, our thinking and our behaviour and our passage through the eternity is a very curious one. And I think in many of these cases, the plausible story will turn out to be true in some, in one form or another.
Yeah, the only issue I've got is, you know, you started writing this book back in 2018, and here we are. We've got some form of pandemic and everything else. You're going on to write about an asteroid that's gonna, or meteorite gonna come down and smash it. Let's hope that doesn't happen. You know what I'm saying? We don't
Yeah.
we don't want to be too near that.
Right.
Well, look, on a parting note, I mean, what type of message would you actually like to pass on to others, you know, during the COVID period? Because I mean, it must be something that worries you slightly.
Well, this is partly linked to nidotherapy and to the story in Polax. Polax is, if anyone reads it, and it's worthwhile mentioning, it's an optimistic story. By the end of the book, everything is tied up. You know that Polax is not going to be a problem for the future because everyone has understood the disease and they know how to deal with it if it ever comes back. And I think we can't think that's possible at the moment with COVID, but it will be the same with COVID. We will tie up most of the loose ends. And the other aspect, which is related to nidotherapy, is that I don't think the way our country and world was going before COVID was particularly positive. In particular, related to climate change and fossil fuels and all the other aspects that were actually wrecking our planet. People weren't making the changes necessary to adjust and compensate for that. I think they will now. I think there'll be and because of, as I say, nidotherapy is when people think about environmental factors which could improve their health. I think we should be able to find a better way of using our environment to help our health, both mental and physical. And I think that is an important message. The other one, which is, I think, developed from history, if you actually look at the most important pandemic in British history, it was in 1666 and 65, 66 after the Great Plague. But the 100 years after the Great Plague was the biggest expansion of British commerce, science, building, development that we've ever had in our history. In other words, people compensate, they think differently and they act differently. So I think there will be a rebound, there'll be a very big rebound after COVID is all over, and it'll be a rebound in the right direction. It's going to make us more sensible, more concerned about our environment, more sympathetic to others. I can imagine all sorts of positive things, and we'd also make some great advances in and of course we've made them in science with the vaccine so far. I think there's going to be lots of advances made which will help our lives. So that's a very positive story, and I don't think it's fanciful, because it's a time of we've been sitting back and marking time, but in fact, when in fact this gets over, we'll get our foot on the accelerator and things will start moving ahead very quickly and very well.
They are great parting words, Peter. I am a fan. I've got to say it. This book, Polax, has certainly kept me going. There's some funny bits in there. There's some very sad bits, very poignant pieces, and everything else. I'm looking forward to the children's book, because I will read that as well. I want to know what's going on there. I would like to return to you at some point, because you've got a few other books out that I think we should explore and get them out there and let the listeners listen to it. How do you feel about that?
Yes, well, I'm happy about that. There is another one which I'm halfway through, which is autobiographical, which is called "So You're the Psychiatrist."
Oh.
And it's about,
I'm definitely going to read that one.
It's about various stories, some of which, because people don't really understand how psychiatrists work and how they live and how they react to people. So I'm trying to get that over in this book. So it's just a collection of really quite long anecdotes of experiences I've had in my career, which I hope will make people understand what psychiatrists do, and it's not just faff around making up stories about people and having no tests to confirm their diagnoses. There's an awful lot goes on in mental health, which is very important, and people ought to know about it.
Sure. Well, we look forward to that. Peter, thank you very much for today. From me, Steve at Channel A Media, we're going to say cheerio, and then we're going to catch up with you next time.
Okay, thank you.